All of you, dear friends, welcome. Glad to have you all here. I'm going to start with a prayer for America before I introduce our speaker. So here goes. Wonderful. O thou kind Lord, this gathering is turning to thee. These hearts are radiant with thy love. These minds and spirits are exhilarated by the message of thy glad tidings. O God, let this American democracy become glorious in spiritual degrees, even as it has aspired to material degrees, and render this just government victorious. Confirm this revered nation to appraise the standard of the oneness of humanity, to promulgate the most great peace, to become thereby most glorious and praiseworthy among all the nations of the world. O God, this American nation is worthy of thy favors and is deserving of thy mercy. Make it precious and near to thee through thy bestowal and bounty and bestowal. Thank you again. When Sovaida Maani proposed her topic, building an effective system of international collective security, I was really excited about it because it seems like such a perfect and timely topic to discuss for us today. Right. I have lived a life where there has been wars all over the world, except for Europe. In my lifetime, there has not been a major war in Europe. There's been wars in the Middle East, there's been wars in Africa, in South America. Europe, it would seem, had learned this lesson. And after 1945, Europe had decided that they were going to be a peaceful continent, only to have this illusion shattered in the last several months. And why do I pick out Europe? Because frankly, the European nations are some of the most powerful nations around, and they have more destructive abilities and more destructive powers than any of the Arabian countries or the India and Pakistan, etc., have. And yet, what was never ever talked about, the threat of nuclear war, is now being floated around and spoken of as if this is a possibility. This really seems like the world is on the verge of something disastrous, something terrible. And we Baha'is believe that our faith provides the answers for what ails mankind. So hearing from Sovaida about building an international collective system of international collective security seems perfect, seems very timely. Sovaida Maani is a lawyer. She's a prolific author, speaker, lawyer, life mastery coach, and founding director of the Center for Peace and Global Governance, which is cpgg.org. Please look into it, Google it, see what she has to say on that. A virtual think tank an online forum that proposes principled solutions to global challenges. Her latest book available on Amazon is The Alchemy of Peace, six essential shifts in mindset and habits to achieve world peace. And by the way, it makes for wonderful reading. It really does. I would recommend it highly to all of you. I bought it and read it and seem to have lent it out to somebody because it's no longer in my home. But it's a wonderful book to read. And I'm so excited and delighted that our friend Sovaida has agreed to come back and share her thoughts with us. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Sovaida.
Thank you. Thank you for the very gracious introduction, and thank you for having me back to talk to you folks in Austin, a long way from us here in Washington, D.C. for a second time round. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I wanted to get a good look at you all initially. And I have, and I'm going to be able to see you. So here's the title of tonight's conversation, which is Building an Effective System of Collective Security, an idea whose time has come. If not now, then when, right? So let's start by providing some context. Baha'is believe that at different times during the course of humanity's collective evolution, a loving creator, regardless of the name that we know the creator by, Allah, Yahweh, God, it really doesn't matter, it's the same creative force, that this loving creator sends us divine educators as a token of his, her love for us. And that the divine teachings and education sent are pitched precisely to meet our capacity at any given time in our collective history to understand spiritual truth and in accordance with the needs of our age. And the idea is that just as our capacity to understand science and technology grows over time, so too our spiritual capacity grows. And it's important to recognize that not only do our capacities grow and change, but that our needs grow and change as well. There's a different analogy that the Baha'i writings offer that I'm also going to share with you, describing these divine teachers sent by the all-loving creator as divine physicians who have their fingers on the pulse of humanity and accurately diagnose the disease when they come and prescribe the proper remedy. When I look at the world, I often feel like we're trying to apply remedies that were applicable to humanity's ills in days past, and we are misdiagnosing the illnesses of the day. So the analogy, as you see on this slide, is trying to administer flu medication when the patient today has cancer. May have had flu 2,000 years ago, got the flu medication, it was wonderfully effective, but it no longer suffices today. So now, there is another concept, and you'll see how all of this ties in with tonight's subject in the Baha'i writings, that humanity as a collective whole is going through various stages of development, and that we are currently going through a period of turbulent adolescence. That's the stage we're in. And that the capacities and tools that we used when we were children are no longer sufficient to serve us at this more mature state of our growth. It's time to cast them away as we transition through this period of turbulent adolescence into adulthood. So Baha'is are very hopeful. We're very optimistic that even though the situation in the world looks very dark with the global pandemic, global economic recession, climate change, which is an existential threat, the war in Ukraine that could lead to a third world war with or without the use of nuclear weapons, that all of these will eventually pass, and these very dark days in human history will yield a bright and glorious future for humanity. But we also believe that just as in our individual lives, tests become repeated until we learn the lesson, so too as a collective humanity, there are certain tests that we're going through collectively, and they're starting to come in waves and in tsunamis, and we still need to learn the lesson. Apropos of the topic of tonight, this is not the first time we're being faced with this particular constellation of issues. We saw the same constellation of issues in Syria, with all the resulting, civil war, use of chemical and weapons, refugees, the displacement of half of the people in the country, large-scale destruction, the arming of militias, what was described in newspapers at the time as a proto-world war with different nations arrayed on both sides of the equation, and the killing of innocents and scorched earth destruction. We didn't learn our lesson then. The lesson being, as we will see, the need to create a system of collective security that's effective, and we'll discuss what that is. But more importantly, we didn't recognize and learn the lesson of the oneness of humanity and our interdependence as peoples and nations. Our responses so far, as these tests come back, have been ineffectual. A great way of thinking about this, is the way I think about it, it's helpful to me, is that in the face of these tsunamis, we're using sandbags. We're saying, oh, let's stack up 5 sandbags, 10 sandbags, 15 sandbags, when what we need to build are mighty, mighty barriers, 40, 50, 60-foot walls. Okay. Now, as we give birth to this new way of being in our new selves, we have to die to the old ways of being. And this brings us to yet another idea shared in the Baha'i writings, this idea that for something new to be born, there are 2 processes that happen simultaneously. The old dies, has to die, while the new starts to develop and evolve and grow. So as we leave the age of childhood and adolescence behind, we have to let go of the old, the things that don't serve us. In other words, we have to die to old ways of being. And here we're talking not just as individuals, but as a collective humanity. When we look at humanity as a whole, this means what? Precisely letting go of institutions, laws, policies, systems of societal organization that no longer serve us. So if you think of humanity as a ship that is starting to sink, what's the first thing you do when you're on a sinking ship? You jettison, you throw out all the heavy stuff that's likely to take you down. And this is the heavy stuff. Now, the war in Ukraine is providing us with another opportunity to grow and evolve and learn some critical lessons. And really the way I see it is that we are at a fork in the road, and we have 2 very stark options. We either deepen our unity or we self-destruct as a human race. It sounds stark, but that's because of the choices we've made thus far that have not been very ennobling and empowering choices for ourselves. We now find ourselves at this unpleasant crossroads. So what does this mean? How do we deepen our unity? Well, it's time to recognize that the world is in desperate need of an effective system of collective security that will deter, first of all, nations from entering into conflicts. And secondly, if they do enter into conflicts, that is capable of restoring the peace once it's breached. So ideally, you want to, like any good doctor would want to do, you want to prevent the disease. But then once you have it, you want to restore. If we think of COVID, we want to vaccinate ourselves as a prophylactic against the virus. But then if we get it, we want to take that wonderful medication that you take within the first 5 days that helps minimize the impact. Now, we have to begin by recognizing that our current system of governance for the world is simply inadequate to meet the needs of an unprecedentedly interconnected and interdependent world. We see this very starkly, you don't have to go far, by the fact that the Security Council of the United Nations, whose only job, it has one task, to maintain peace and security on this, on this planet, has been unable to stop many wars, including the war in Ukraine, including the war in Tigray, including the war in Yemen. There are many, many, many wars. And by the way, there have been other wars in Europe as well, including in Serbia, in Kosovo. So Ukraine is not actually the first war since the end of the Second World War, but because of the threat and the fear of the use of nuclear weapons, we're all actually sitting up and paying attention now. If we had paid attention before, maybe we wouldn't have ended up where we are now. So we're being given the opportunity with this Ukraine crisis or war or conflict or whatever you want to call it, to look reality squarely in the eye and embrace it and say, okay, we are where we are. Not until we recognize where we are can we then think about what choices we're going to take to get to somewhere different. And we first have to envision what that destination is. We also have to fully take responsibility for the fact that we are where we are as a result of choices we've made. Having said that, we must recognize that who we are now because of choices in the past does not define who we need to be in the future. In other words, we need to recognize that we are endowed with this amazing gift of free will choice as individuals and as a collective humanity to move in a different and more empowering direction. And we have to recognize that whatever choices we make have to be made in the context of accepting our current reality as the human race, which is that we are interconnected. We have become like organs and limbs of the human body. Whether we like it or not, it is a reality. So let's look and see how this war in Ukraine is hitting us squarely between the eyes with this reality that somehow we still haven't learned, that we're interconnected, interdependent, and therefore we are one. So how is the war in Ukraine doing this? Examples. It was very easy initially to say, especially for those of us in the United States, oh, this war is happening over there in Europe. It's none of our business. Let them duke it out. Let them fight it out with each other. However, very quickly, first thing that became apparent was that the war in Ukraine triggered a global food crisis. Why? Ukraine is called the breadbasket of the world. It produces 33% of all the world's wheat. That is 1/3 of the world's wheat, 17% of the world's corn, 32% of the world's barley, and 30% of their farmland, it is estimated, could become a war zone. Also, a large chunk of the world's fertilizers, potash-based fertilizers that are particularly effective at producing wonderful crop yields, are grown in Ukraine. So what is the result? As soon as the war in Ukraine started, in countries as far away as Egypt and in 53 African nations, the price of bread started to go up. And people became unable to buy the one thing that was their staple, like the basic, if all you can afford is bread, and now you can no longer afford bread, it leads to death and destruction, to disease, and all the studies have shown that the biggest factor that triggers instability and conflict is the price of bread and staples. In fact, the Arab Spring was triggered because the price of bread went up. So we have a lot of unpleasantness to look forward to. The UN actually estimates that just without the fertilizer, we're not even talking about the wheat now, 7.6 to 13.1 million people could go hungry in the world. So this little war, putting aside nuclear, putting aside all of that, has triggered a global food crisis and a hunger crisis. The second thing we all immediately realized affected us everywhere, including the United States, is the global energy crisis. Oh, wow, we don't have enough access to oil and natural gas because Russia is such a huge producer, and Ukraine is now, the ports and the pipelines are being affected. So the cost of energy started going up. And I know even in our area, in Washington, D.C., I talk to people who worry about whether they can afford the price of gasoline to get to work and back. So it is actually impacting day-to-day lives for people everywhere, including the richest country on earth. So if it's impacting us, imagine what it's doing to the rest of the world. The cost of sanctions is a third thing that we're learning from the war in Ukraine. It's our tool of choice because we don't have an effective system of collective security. But it's a long, drawn-out process, and it ends up inflicting pain on everyone, including a lot of innocent people in all countries, including countries that are not even part of the conflict. Another lesson that we've learned that is teaching us that we are so interconnected is the danger of escalation to nuclear war. Now, you may not know this, but experts who have studied this subject tell us, and they have done this actually in the context of analyzing what would happen if a small little baby nuclear war, limited one, broke out between Pakistan and India, both of whom are nuclear powers. So there has been worry about nuclear war actually over Kashmir and other parts of the world, over Taiwan, with China and the United States, and with China over islands in the South China Seas. There are actually a lot of potential flashpoints for nuclear danger. It's just that we've stuck our heads in the sand. Not that this is like, oh, the first real time where we're exposed to danger. This time it's become so real that we're actually being forced to see it. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? But here's what the experts, going back to my story, discovered. Even if there's a very short nuclear war that occurs in a very limited geographical area for a very short time, it will result in 10 years of no summer, meaning no crops, and could result in 2 billion people starving. 2 billion. And that's just if God forbid this war in Ukraine were to end up even in a limited nuclear war, apart from the hundreds of millions who would die because of the nuclear explosions and the decimation of property and the fact that a lot of places would be uninhabitable, like Chernobyl was when the Chernobyl disaster occurred. Apart from all of that stuff, we will also likely have 2 billion people dying of starvation around the world. And the last thing that is being brought to our attention is, wow, we're in danger of weapons of mass destruction other than nuclear being used, biological or chemical weapons. And again, we've been there before with Syria. We've seen what the effects can be. And the question is, what are we going to do? So the answer is, according to the Baha'i writings, is what you see on this slide. We need to radically reconceptualize our understanding of society and begin by understanding that when we seek solutions to any problem, we understand that the interests of all nations are fused. The way we've been dealing with international relations and treating each other's nations is what people call realpolitik. It's this endless attempt to balance an equilibrium of interests. Really, it's time to ask ourselves the question, we've been doing this for hundreds of years. How well has this worked for us? And the answer is not very well. Besides, you're constantly on tenterhooks. One country does this and then all nations react, and you constantly saying, okay, should I start trying to deal with this bilaterally or trilaterally or create small coalitions? But there's never a sense that the world as a whole has come up with a process and a system to say, if this happens, here collectively is how we're going to address it. Now, the only untried yet only viable system that we need we need to create to solve this problem is to create a system of collective security. Let me back up for a second and say, where are we now? When problems like Ukraine happen in wars, we do one of 3 things. We let countries get away with it. We did that when Russia went into Chechnya between 1994 and 2000. We did that when Russia went into Georgia in 2008. We did that when Russia went into Syria from 2013 onwards, especially 2013 and 2017. And we did that when Russia went into Crimea in 2014. We then draw red lines and we don't do anything about them. So what happens is we encourage nations to act with impunity. If we can't take effective action, what ends up happening is that the takeaway for countries who behave badly is, oh, just like a child. Oh, wow, I broke the rule. I got away with it. Mom and dad didn't do anything. So I can keep breaking the rules. And next time they'll do something even worse. And this is the pattern that we've seen, as I just noted, with Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, Crimea, and now the Ukraine. And what happens is that such action of letting countries get away with it means that we are basically giving countries carte blanche to expand the terrain in which war occurs. And we are telling them that even if you have a limited nuclear war, you know what, it's okay, even though, as we discussed, 2 billion people are likely to starve as a result. Now, the other thing we do when generally faced with situations like this right now is we act unilaterally. So one powerful country will stand up and say, wait a minute, somebody's got to do something. I'm going to do it. And it's usually the United States. And we know that that doesn't work so well because of the backlash, because there's a lack of trust. Like, why are you doing this? Who made you the world's policeman? Are you doing it because you hate our religion? Are you doing it because you want our oil and gas? What's the story here? And we arrogate nefarious motives, which may be true or not true. I'm not getting into that, but it's just not a very effective way for actually solving global challenges, including global war and security challenges. Alternatively, if we don't act unilaterally, we act in coalitions. So a bunch of nations get together and go in. That's what we did with the Korean War in the 1950s. It's what we did when Iraq illegally invaded Kuwait and we had the first Gulf War. It was a coalition of nations with the United States at the helm that went in. But again, there was backlash because the terrorist organizations that then grew said, hey, you only did this because you wanted our oil. You only did this because you hate Muslims. So again, didn't work out so well. The only way to stand up really to bully in the playground is for everyone in the playground from all backgrounds, including the background of the bully themselves, to say, look, this doesn't have to do with our religion or with our race or with the fact that you don't like us. It's that you are disrupting the peace of the world and you can't do this. It's a very simple calculus. Now, those are the two things we've tended to do. I want to highlight a reality and then move on to what we need to be doing in light of the guidance given in the Baha'i writings. At least this is a suggestion that we're humbly offering. What's fascinating to me is that everyone today is clamoring for security. The Russians are worried about melting ice along their northern border with the Arctic and the presence of NATO troops along their western border. They feel like they've got thousands of miles of exposed borders, and they're worried that if anyone comes and is out to get them, that they'll be able to infiltrate. So they want to have buffer zones. So if one listens to this, kind of putting aside all politics and, you know, what's really going on in the mind of this guy or that guy, you can say, well, okay, that's you know, I can understand that you feel insecure. So let's take that into account. Meanwhile, Ukraine is worried about her security. I don't know how many of you remember, but in 1993, Ukraine gave up her nuclear weapons. She was the third largest owner of nuclear weapons in the world. Gave it up in return for security assurances from Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Now, look at the message that what's going on right now sends, the wrong message. That, oh, if you want to be safe from invasion by a nuclear country, you better go out and get your own nuclear arms, and then they'll leave you alone because there'll be mutual assured destruction, this deterrent value. And indeed, a bunch of countries are already starting to ask and looking into means of acquiring their own nuclear weapons, like Saudi Arabia, who's watching this and is worried about Iran, and South Korea, that is watching this and is worried about North Korea and China, and on and on and on. So we're not on a very good trajectory. The last thing we need is another nuclear arms race, okay? And so everybody's worried about security. Now, isn't that interesting? There is a common need and a common challenge, and one that we can address with what we're here to talk about tonight, Baha'u'llah's vision of collective security. It is the only thing that we have not yet tried. And yet, I believe I've been doing work in this area for 20 years now, since 2000, 2001. It's the only viable solution. So how do we begin? The Baha'i writings suggest that we begin with a core group of the world's leaders coming together. Leaders who have certain qualities of being trustworthy. So people of the world generally trust them. They look at them and say, yeah, this woman or this man are trustworthy. They seem to have the best intentions of all of us in mind. They're not out for number one themselves. Who are courageous and willing to do the hard thing, even if it's unpopular. Who are high-minded, who have lofty goals like peace in the world, who have no other agenda or objective but establishing peace. So they're not saying, okay, we'll do this if you scratch our backs and give us all these other 10 things that we want. Give us financial aid, give us more weapons, give us whatever it is that countries usually ask for in these quid pro quos. And the Baha'i writings then say that this core group of leaders should come up with an international covenant, a treaty. And once they've arrived at basically the provisions of it, they should then go and talk to all the other world leaders and get them to sign on as well, because you need to have collective buy-in. Second point, this agreement has to be binding on everyone. No opt-outs. Most of our international treaties today are considered contracts where people can opt in and opt out, including the treaties to do with biological, chemical, nuclear weapons. It's actually crazy. And so as soon as a country wants to do something nefarious, they opt out. What kind of child's play is this, right? Third thing, according to this schema, the amount of arms owned by each nation has to be limited to the amount necessary for that nation to maintain order within its borders. So in my mind, the way I conceive of this, and what I would propose is that we create an international commission that is representative, that is trusted by people in the world. And I've written extensively about this. I don't want to get into all the details. I just want to give you the idea here. An international commission to do an intensive study of each nation and its needs. What does each nation need to maintain order within its borders? Do you know? I don't. I don't know the quantity of arms and troops that they need. And once that's established, have the world agree to this, and then destroy whatever excess they have between what's necessary and what they actually have under international supervision. So you don't just leave it up to them to do it and trust the honor system, because the honor system hasn't worked. It's the system we have right now is the honor system. But when a nation wants to do something bad, you can't trust them to be honorable. I mean, it's again, we would never, I always say to people, my students and people I work with, you know, if somebody is accused of murder, you don't ask them, would you like to come to court or not? And then, would you like to abide by the judgment of the court? It's an honor system. Please take the keys to the jail, let yourself in and stay there for 25 years and then let yourself out. No, we would laugh at such a notion. And yet at the international level, that's exactly how our system is crafted. Is it any wonder that nations are initiating wars? They know they can get away with it. We need to be smart enough to create a system that ensures that they can't get away with it. And then they're going to think twice. All right. All nuclear weapons have to be eliminated. There is no good reason for anybody to have nuclear weapons, and we can do phase down destructions. There are a lot of studies on how this can be done in an equitable manner. It doesn't make sense for one nation to suddenly give up all its nuclear weapons, because then other nuclear weapon powers could threaten it. So everybody, phased percentages, you get rid of 20%, I get rid of 20%, everybody else gets rid of 20%, and so on and so forth, with deadlines and again, under supervision. Another feature of Baha'u'llah's system of collective security is that all nations must agree in this covenant to dispense with war as an instrument of international relations. And if any country arises to use war or conflict or whatever special term you want to apply to it, a special military operation, it really doesn't matter. If you're going to use weapons against somebody else and thereby breach the peace of the world, all the nations agree in advance under this treaty to unitedly arise against this nation and use all tools within its power, including, if necessary, the use of force in order to bring that government to heel. Also, all nations need to act proactively and have foresight, be able to imagine what the results are of not having such a system. Another feature is that the system has to be founded on the basis of a set of foundational principles of what some people call global ethics. Principles like justice, principles like truth, principles like oneness. Those are probably the three big ones. So just to give you a simple example of how this works, imagine a Security Council that was created where the premise wasn't, oh, the 5 nuclear powers need to be the most powerful and have veto power, but was premised on the understanding of the oneness of nations. Under such a system, if you had that as a premise, that foundational principle, it would be impossible to have any kind of veto system. How can I say to you, I treat you equally and I view you as one with me, but you know what? I understand better than you what's good for you and me. And so I'm going to override you anytime you want to share your views. So that's a very easy way to understand that the amazing impact of weaving the set of global ethics into the very structures, institutions, policies, and processes that we create under this new system of collective security. In short, we need to, again, I want to hammer this home, understand that the only way to deal effectively with the bully on the playground is to take a united stand against the bully. Now, you know what I find really exciting is that, remember we said this lesson, the opportunity to learn this lesson has come back over and over and over again, that this test has kept repeating itself. Well, here with the Ukraine war, we've seen a few glimmerings that I find exciting, and I hope to God that we continue with them. The first glimmering was a statement that the president of Ukraine made in his address to the US Congress, in which he said, listen, guys, we need to all acknowledge, the whole world needs to acknowledge that we need to create new tools, I'm quoting here, to respond quickly and stop war, wherever it is in the world. And he also notes that, quote, today the world does not have such tools. In fact, at some point he'd said to people in the United Nations and the Security Council, if you guys aren't capable of doing your job, which is stopping war, then you should go home, stop collecting a salary. I mean, I think that's a really fair comment. I've been saying something similar for years. It's like, we need to wake up and realize what we're doing. This is not child's play anymore. And then he called for the establishment, which I thought that the idea itself is really fascinating to me, the creation of what he called the U-24. Now, he is probably not aware that in the mid-1860s, Baha'u'llah had already envisioned a system of collective security for the world that we just unpacked. So here we are after 2 world wars and all these other wars, and now the humanity coming face to face with the specter of a potential nuclear war, where this one leader in the world is saying, wow, we need to create something called a U-24, U standing for United for Peace. So all the nations coming together to be united for peace. I mean, that's a great idea. Again, I'm not taking political sides here, but if an idea is a good idea for everyone, we need to be able to say, unity for peace is a good thing, no matter who says it, right? And then the 24 stands for a goal that within 24 hours of conflict breaking out or war breaking out anywhere in the world, the whole world should be able to come together and put an end to it within 24 hours. As a famous coach, Tony Robbins, I love him, says, he says, when do you kill Godzilla? Not when he's Godzilla, but when he's a baby. So when the problem is still small, you nip it in the bud. You don't wait until it festers and festers. And this has been the heart-wrenching thing about the war in Ukraine. Weeks before the war even started, we knew, because intelligence sources were telling the media and the media was telling us, war is going to start. They even had a prediction of basically it's going to happen between this week and this week, because after that, Ukraine, the rains come and it gets muddy and the tanks won't be able, they'll get stuck in the mud. So we know it has to be over by this date. Here the number of troops, 150,000. I mean, we had specifics. Here are the number of tanks, here's the amount of artillery. And what did we do? It was like a horror movie. We're all paralyzed. Our leaders were paralyzed. Everyone stood back and said, oh, let's see what happens. And every day we turn on the news and we read the newspaper. Oh, has it started yet? Has it started yet? Oh my gosh, I'm so scared. So instead of actually taking action to do something, we just stood by. And at every step, we've done too little, too late. And here we are now in the third month of a conflict that has decimated the lives of millions of people. It's really heartrending. Another, on the positive side, another interesting, wonderful thing that is happening that is demonstrative of these forces of integration that I was talking about that accompany the forces of disintegration is that countries that have hitherto always been neutral, including Switzerland, that has been neutral for 200 years, has never taken sides in a war, sending military aid to Ukraine. I mean, that is an earth-shattering historical event. However you want to interpret it, it is historical. And two other countries that have desperately remained neutral at all costs because they are so close to Russia, and they're sandwiched between Russia and the West, namely Sweden and Finland, are thinking of joining NATO, another earth-shattering event, right? So it's forcing, in other words, everybody, all nations and all people to rethink and reconceptualize. Now, the conceptions that we have right now are very limited. We're still gravitating to old ways of being. Oh, there's NATO and there's not NATO. We need to move far beyond that to Baha'u'llah's vision of we need to all be united, all create a universal system of collective security where all our security concerns, whether you're Russia or Ukraine or Estonia or Lithuania or Poland or Latvia or Finland, it doesn't matter who, or Germany or Hungary or Romania or Moldova, all of your security concerns will be taken into consideration and dealt with, and where you will all feel safe without having to resort to conflict and war and decimate each other. That is this truly new radical conception. Now, there are other few, just so because I'm anticipating questions. So this is not the end of Baha'u'llah's vision of collective security. I've shared with you the essential component part, but Baha'u'llah's program for collective security encompasses a whole bunch of other features that I'm not going to go into in detail, but I just want to highlight them for you so you understand that they're there. The Baha'is are not naive, and we don't just have this concept that somehow the system of collective security is magically going to manifest itself. So it requires a properly functioning international court. that has compulsory jurisdiction, in other words, is able to hear cases like in this instance, to whom does this territory, if there is actually a question, to whom does this territory in Ukraine belong on the eastern border in the Donbass, you take it to the international court. You don't start a war over it. You don't send troops in. Both Russia and the Ukraine go to a properly functioning court and say, you decide, and then there's also enforcement of the court's decision. We have to have a system for enforcement. So in other words, we need a world executive also that is capable of enforcing the decisions of a world court and of a world legislature. And we need an international standing force, something that Baha'u'llah talked about as part of his vision of collective security. A force that is comprised of units from all the nations of the world. So everybody has troops and units. It's not a coalition. It is not unilateral. And they act under the direction of an international legislature that is directly elected by the people of the world and has the authority to pass binding legislation in certain narrow spheres where the collective good of the planet is involved and can only be solved collectively. Climate change. No one nation, no 10 nations, 20 nations, 50 nations can solve climate change. It has to be the world community coming together as a whole and passing binding legislation. And I don't know if you've seen apropos of that lately, that the IPCC, the UN body that is tracking climate change, is saying that since the Stockholm conference, nations have not been following through on their pledges to do what is necessary to keep global warming down. And in fact, because of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine has now exacerbated everything. So here we are again. And the last thing that the Baha'i writings talk about that I find fascinating is that we as the electorate need to be educated to elect leaders that are fit to meet the challenges of the day. It is our own fault that we get leaders that are paralyzed, that are not able to act swiftly, effectively, efficiently, and take into account the realities on the ground, namely the oneness and interdependence of the human race. This failure of leaders to recognize and read-write the signs of the time, meaning the oneness of humanity, has been the root cause, according to the Baha'i writings, of all the challenges that we face today. Lastly, the benefits of a system of collective security, according to the lines envisioned by Baha'u'llah, are many. When there's a problem like the Ukraine war or the Tigrayan war, or the Yemen war, we can act quickly, decisively, and nip the problems in the bud. An analogy I want to leave you with is Whipple surgery. I don't know if you are familiar with pancreatic cancer. Unfortunately, I have reason to, because we know people who have had pancreatic cancer. But while it is confined in the pancreas, there's a form of surgery that can be performed called a Whipple surgery, where they go in and they basically scoop all the cancer out. And they also have to remove a part of the pancreas and the stomach and the colon and so on. But that's it. After that, you don't need to go through chemotherapy, and the cancer hopefully doesn't metastasize. In other words, it doesn't spread in the body. Now, to me, the system of collective security, that's its function, to go in and excise this cancer before it spreads in the body of humanity, before it becomes a world war, before it becomes a nuclear war. And so this is one of the benefits. The other benefit is nations would think twice before acting with impunity. If the head of a country who's about to initiate a war knows that the global community has a standing army and that there are rules about when it will be used, and that nations will stand up immediately and bring her or his government to heel, they would think twice about acting. And no one's nation's military finances and human resources will be strained and stretched. If everybody is in it together, we all share in the burdens. Okay, that is basically the summing up. If you have liked this presentation and you want to learn more about some of these ideas, you might enjoy reading any one of these books that you can get on Amazon anywhere. One is a short book that is a favorite amongst young people. It's an easy half an hour, 40-minute read. It's called Building a World Federation, The Key to Resolving Our Global Crises. The second that Ajit mentioned at the beginning was The Alchemy of Peace, that was written last year. And the third is Collective Security Within Reach, and it actually unpacks in great detail a lot of the ideas, again, like a commission to figure out the amount of arms that each nation needs to maintain order, or a commission to finally set boundaries, given everything we now know about the world and the and the relationships across borders of peoples and so on, and how to build a standing force, what are the exact steps you take, and so on. So I will now stop sharing my slide and we can talk.
I'm anxious to ask a question.
Okay. Go for it.
We as a nation, America, spend approximately $800 billion a year on the Department of Defense. I don't know what we're defending, but it's the Department of Defense. I've always commented that America needs a Department of Peace, not a Department of War. But is there a potential disruption to this nation if it stops spending money on defense, guns and nuclear wars and things? Because I live in a big city, as you do in Washington, D.C. I see the problems on the streets of my city that could use a lot of money. Instead of buying guns, perhaps we could build a school or two or three. Any comments on the disruption if peace breaks out?
Well, let me break down your question. Let me begin by saying that it would be very unwise and actually foolish. And this comes from things in the Baha'i writings. I'm not just speaking off the top of my head. For one country alone to give up its Department of Defense or weapons while the rest of the world is armed. Because what do you think? What do you think the people who are out to get you will do? It's like, oh, great. Field day. This is exactly the calculation that was made apropos of Ukraine. They're weak. They gave up nuclear arms. They're weak. Their army isn't strong. We can go and wipe them out. So you're inviting disaster, number one. So this has to be done collectively by everyone. And this is why Baha'u'llah has crafted his vision of collective security, as in everybody needs to be on board. It can't be one nation begins unilaterally, lay down its arms, because it will just be overrun. By the way, Costa Rica tried that and Nicaragua took full advantage. So if you want a case study, feel free to look at that. You do make an excellent point that the world, including the United States, is squandering large sums of money that should be used and could be used and should be used to feed people, to house people, to deal with social problems, to deal with race issues, to provide childcare, to on and on and on, everything to deal with climate change, to adapt to climate change. There's so many dire needs. And if we freed up the several $1 trillion that the world spends every year on that and reallocated those monies, absolutely. And I think that one of the things in this country that is going to happen with this war in Ukraine is people are probably going to start calculating, and people are already thinking about it. Wait a minute, you keep sending billions of dollars to Ukraine. You just asked for another 33 billion, and yet we have so many problems here at home. How much sense does this make? And that's why I said the beauty of a collective system of collective security as envisioned by Baha'u'llah, is that everybody bears the burden. And by the way, this leads me to the third point. Studies have been done on how much it would cost to establish a standing force. And startup costs are a few billion, like 3 or 4 billion. And then every year after that, $1 billion. Imagine, between the wars, just this country has fought in Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Ukraine. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions. Imagine if we had an international standing army and the whole world together was putting 1 to 2 billion a year. I mean, honestly, it's just a no-brainer in so many different respects. So yes, good point about the need to reallocate, and it would be a wonderful disruption, but it has to be done collectively.
Since nobody else has a question, please put your questions in chat.
Yes, I enjoyed your talk very much. It is really super informative and very nice. By the way, tomorrow morning, I'm going to a meeting that I have to talk about very same subject, except
Excellent.
that I have to talk only 2 minutes, not more than 2 minutes, only 2 minutes. But then my question is, who is really going to do this first? How do you line up the countries to do that? And one thing that Baha'is know, that we cannot interfere into politics, is that if I'm not a congressman and if I'm not going to run for the president of a country, how am I able to enforce anything to the rest of the world? Therefore, is this just a dream? Is this just something we're waiting? Maybe when the Messiah comes, it's going to happen. That's what people tell you, you know, when you talk about stuff like that, and they say, oh, you're dreaming.
Sure. Okay. So excellent question. Fascinating that you went from one extreme to another. So yes, and that's how people pitch it to you, right? They box you in with false dichotomies. Let me explain. Yes, Baha'is do not interfere in partisan politics, and we can't run for office. So we're not in a position to be the decision makers. However, the real power is in the ideas, and it is the people who elect the decision makers. One of the most important things that we need to do is to disseminate these ideas amongst the grassroots. And you don't need to have a huge number of people. There's, there are all these studies on the critical minority for ideas to travel when they become then part of the global, the general consciousness, whether it's the national consciousness or the global consciousness. So our job, as the Baha'i writings very clearly said, this question was asked of one of the leaders of the faith in the 1930s. And his response was that although the Baha'is cannot implement this, the creation of a system of collective security, there is no reason why we cannot be at the forefront of disseminating these ideas. If there is a good idea that will save the world and that will help the world, it is our bounden responsibility to share it. So who will do it, is your question. It is not a dream. When people say that to me, I say, actually, you're the one living the dream, because what is the alternative? The alternative is self-destruction. Really? You want to self-destruct? That is, we're in a train that is going at top speed, that is going off the edge of a cliff. And when anyone gives us an idea of how to veer the train around, change direction, slow it down, we say, oh, you're a dreamer. I say to them, no. You're the ones who've stuck your heads in the sand and you're beyond dream. You're fast asleep, dreaming the dreams of the heedless. So wake up, because you need to understand where your lack of action is taking you first. The second thing is, who's going to do it? the world situation is going to, and is, we're seeing this. There was a time when we used to say, well, we know the world situation is going to get bad, and people would say, oh, you're exaggerating, okay? So just in the last 2 years, we've had a global pandemic, we have a global economic recession, climate change is continuing to barrel between floods and wildfires and tornadoes and death and destruction caused by climate change and entire countries disappearing under the oceans and so on. This is no longer, oh, you guys are making stuff up in your heads, okay? Now we have the war with Ukraine with the potential for a world war, a nuclear war. So nations are going to be squeezed. That's why I said the opportunity here is here, and we will learn it. It's just a question of how many more of these calamities do we need? Do we actually need to have a nuclear war? And maybe we do. Maybe that will happen if we continue on this trajectory we're on. And it may not be now with Ukraine, but if we don't create a system of collective security along the lines envisioned by Baha'u'llah, we're going to find ourselves here again in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Maybe this time it'll be over Taiwan and the nuclear power will be China. Maybe it'll be over the islands in the South China Seas. We will, if we ratchet this up, we will get to a nuclear war. There is not a shadow of a doubt. And the question is this really the line you want to go down? Now, who is going to make the decision? Leaders who wake up. Mr. Zelensky seems to have woken up with respect to collective security, because look at what it's taking, the death and devastation of his country. Yeah. So we need to find a handful of leaders, not we need to find, I mean, those leaders need to find themselves. And just as a year ago, nobody would have anticipated that any leader would stand up and say, we need to create a collective system of security called a United for Peace 24. You and I couldn't have dreamt that up, but it's now happened. I feel very confident that there will be other leaders who similarly come to the realization of, oh my gosh, we can't keep going on as before. And yes, we are so interconnected. And I'm starting to see a lot of articles about the fact that, you know what, it's so funny. War is costly, not just because of troops and weapons. It's like, oh my gosh, it's distracting us from all the things each of our countries needs to be doing at home. And it's interfering with our ability to deal with climate change. We just can't afford this anymore. We can't afford war wherever it is anymore. So that's how it's going to happen. Circumstances, what the Baha'is call the major plan of God. This is God acting in the world, and coupled with bad choices that we've made that have brought us to this point. So we don't need to worry about creating the circumstances where those leaders will appear, because they have to. They will be brought to their knees because of world events. That's who will do it. In the meantime, once those leaders then have the will, hopefully the Baha'is will have been one of the groups who have shared ideas of what then this well-intentioned group of leaders could do. That's our job. And the job of optimism, spreading optimism. Because I tell you, that is the biggest disease in the world today, is the lack of hope. The cynicism, the skepticism, the lack of hope. You cannot build a future on cynicism. Yeah. So that was a long answer, but it involved different parts that I wanted.
Wonderful. But may I ask one more question? And when you said the voters have to be educated to vote for the right person, you do read about them, for example, for California, and you read about 24 people. Which one do you choose? They all are corrupted. There is no one better than the other one. They all, in their own way, do things that is against humanity.
Okay. So we need to take So we need to take a step back. So you don't start with once people have self-nominated. So the system, the election system is broken. We need to start having conversations. And by the way, this is covered. There's an entire chapter on it in my book, The Alchemy of Peace. I think you might be interested in it. We need to start by, again, accepting our reality, where we are now and how we got here. So our system is broken. We have it begins with how we conceive of the notion of power. Human beings generally in this country and everywhere think of power and the role of people in power as there to dominate and control other people and to have access to resources of all kinds, and then to use them for their own benefits. That's how we think of power. We have to change, we have to start having conversations again in which we offer a whole new approach to power. So imagine now if I were to say to you, power and the role of a person in authority is to simply create those conditions in which you and I and everyone else can fulfill our potential. Oh, wow. Now, as soon as you start thinking about the kind of person you're going to vote for this kind of power, you're automatically going to start thinking in terms of a different kind of leader, because your definition of what a leader does has suddenly changed. Who is the person who's likely to take everybody's good into account and who's going to be humble enough and truthful enough and courageous enough and a unity builder and not have prejudices to create conditions where everybody, regardless of background, age, class, gender, blah, 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 can fulfill their potential. That's how we start. It's a process. It's not, yeah, right now you got 24 candidates. They've come up through a corrupt political system. The system itself is corrupt. So of course you're going to get, that's a no-brainer. But we also need to start educating ourselves in other ways, to not look at what people promise. This whole idea of platforms and promises is for the birds. A person may even be very well-intentioned when they make their promises, but then once they're in power, because again of the corruption, the involvement of lobbying groups and money and the role of campaign financing, they're then beholden. They're not actually independent agents. They're beholden to all these people who paid for them. So again, we need to be talking about how do we fix our system? How do we get rid of campaign finance? This is a very long conversation that we need to start having now. And then we need to start getting smart about, okay, then in that context, when we look for leaders, what kind of qualities are we looking for? Someone who's truthful and honest and courageous and on and on and on, and who's not out for themselves. And how do we know that? Because we look at their past history over the last 20, 30 years. How's this person behave towards their spouse, towards their employees, towards their business colleagues? In today's internet age, it's very easy to find that stuff out. We need to hone the skill of the independent investigation of truth. So there are many components that go hand in hand. We need to reconsider the idea of political parties. You know that the first president of the United States, George Washington, warned us when he stepped down. He said, beware that you don't establish, there were no political parties at the time. He said, don't go down that road. It'll be the kiss of death. And there are, again, many people now starting to talk about what would it look like if we didn't have political parties. These are all conversations that the Baha'is need to be engaged in and ought to be engaged in, and to share like, hey, take a look at the Baha'i administrative system. There's a lot you can learn from it. And it's also proof that it works in the real world. We're not smoking weed here. We're not, out to lunch.
Right.
We actually are doing this all around the world, and we have been for quite a while, over 170 years. So thank you very much. So, all right.
Thank
The
you.
question here, it says in the past 120 years, political will has not remained constant. We have seen great advancements in global mindedness, often after devastating wars, but these are eventually followed by retreats to nationalistic thinking and xenophobia. How can the retreats be prevented? If we cannot, the system set up will not hold. Is it through just more economics? How do we prevent retreats from our high-mindedness?
Yeah, so I think the governing body of the Baha'i faith has responded to this very well. So the short answer is no. We've tried doing it through economics, globalization. It's not enough. What is actually needed, and the Universal House of Justice, the governing body of the Baha'i faith, is referred to, and especially lately again has been hammering this point home in letters in the last 2 years sent to the Baha'is of the world, that one of the role of these calamities that we're experiencing, starting with the pandemic and climate change and so on, is to engender and create in human beings and the insights and the awareness of our oneness. It is only when we truly understand that we are one and interconnected, not that, oh, gee, I benefit from globalization and the interconnectedness of economics and the economic benefits, or, oh, gee, I hate globalization because I've lost my job and don't have opportunities. It's more about, wow, whether we like it or not, we are members of a human body. And if we want, and recognizing the principle that if I want the good of my country in today's interconnected world, the only way to ensure it is by ensuring the good of all countries. When that realization comes, there will never be a retreat from it. Because once the liver understands that it can't say to the kidneys, I don't care if you're diseased, I don't care that you have cancer, I'm out for number one, that is a truly nonsensical statement, it will act in a way that will cause it to suffer as well. Eventually, the whole body will be diseased. So we will stop doing this back and forth. And you're right. This is, again, and that Universal House of Justice talks about this pattern. The good news is that with every step forward, we have learned certain lessons that we can use, both about what to do and what not to do. And then we've slid back and we've experienced what it's like. But the true first of all, I read in your question is like, will it ever stick? Can we have hope? Yes, it will stick. But that's when it's going to happen, is when we truly understand that bottom line question. Abdul Baha, one of the central figures of the Baha'i faith, says that with the coming of every revelation, one big theme has been brought to the world. And that in this, the Baha'i revelation, the awareness of the oneness of humanity is the central theme. It's the pivot around which all the other principles of the Baha'i faith revolve. And this is the thing that we need to learn. Once we learn that, and this is not that everyone has to be Baha'is, learning that we're interconnected and interdependent. As I said, the global food crisis, the global energy crisis, the fact that if we have a nuclear war, 2 billion will starve everywhere in the world, not just around where it happened. All of this it's starting to create this insight of, oh, wow, yeah. I put it a particular way that my daughter finds funny. I say the egg has been scrambled. Once the egg's scrambled, you can't unscramble it. We can't go back to being individual eggs, right? As countries and peoples. It's one dish.
I have a question that's somewhat personal, but also somewhat maybe political. I come from the India-Pakistan subcontinent, and I was very distressed by India being neutral in this Ukraine-Russia issue. And I wish they had actually taken sides, frankly. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's normal. If you put yourself in the shoes of the people who are doing or not doing something, everybody wants to maintain their right to have a free hand to do what they want to do if they're ever faced with a similar situation. And there's no mystery to it. It's not political in the sense of, everybody knows many countries have failed to, and that is everybody knows, and it's being written about very openly, that all the countries that have not stood up and been part of collective sanctions or whatever, that's the reason why, because they have issues in their own backyard that they're worried could at some point, someday, maybe flare up, and they want to not have somebody turn around to them and say, oh, but remember when this happened over there, you stood up against it. So how come you're doing it now? They just abstain. And they couch it as, oh, we're neutral. But that's not what's actually going on. They're not being neutral. What they're doing is they're giving themselves carte blanche to do what they want at some point. And maybe the situation will never arise, but either way, that's the calculation.
By the way, I have a friend online, Amos Benning, who's really quiet, which is surprising. Amos, if you're there, at least let us look at your face.
No pressure.
Amos is from your part of the world. He's from moved to Houston from Baltimore, so he's from the Baltimore.
Oh wow! Okay, went in the other direction.
Yeah, there was a question here. It says when you talk about reduction in arms throughout the world, that one of the biggest challenges we will face is giving up our individual weapons in America.
Oh right, yeah. Well, we'll cross that bridge. You know, again, remember that this will only happen once we've all suffered enough and the realization has come that we just have to, for our own sakes, we will want, in other words, people will want it. And people generally don't get to that point, unfortunately, until they've suffered a lot, physically, mentally, emotionally, and otherwise. And that saddens me because people in other parts of the world are already suffering a lot. I mean, I've always thought to myself, I used to say to my daughter, I can't imagine living in Syria during the 14 years of civil war. Can you imagine? I mean, you look at these cities, they're just like the cities we're seeing on TV every day in the Ukraine, bombed out shells, people scurrying like rats from one bombed out building to another. In Mariupol, drinking water out of puddles in the street. I mean, really being reduced to inhumane, horrible conditions. Not finding food or bread or water, or what are we doing? And maybe that's what's going to happen here. Actually, tomorrow is part of I have a video podcast I now do once a month. Tomorrow is episode 31, and it's actually on the question of how do civil wars start? And it is actually a real wake-up call, very interesting studies done on the conditions and factors and triggers that lead to civil war. And it is actually quite shocking how susceptible many Western democracies, including our own here in this country, are right now to a civil war. And I sometimes think, I hope to God that we don't have to go through something as awful as another civil war before we too suffer enough and wake up. So, but again, given the choices we're making, you know, I do life coaching, and I ask people in their own lives, you know, how do you think, as you continue, if you keep making the same choice, where do you think it's going to end up? And I think if we started asking ourselves as a nation, given the road we're on, the direction we're going, if we continue in this direction, where we're going to end up, and then say, and how would we like that? What are the costs? Are we willing to bear the costs? Or do we want to do something different? And if we do, what is that thing that we want to do differently? And then creating consultative spaces to bridge the divides between people and try to reconcile and harmonize. And by the way, Farnaz, I think this is another place where the Baha'is play a huge role. I think of us as the weavers of the social fabric. You know, when the fabric gets torn, we try to weave it together and bring people together and harmonize views and elevate views so people come out of their nitpicking, very narrowly crafted, limited little fights that they have over things. So, because there are far bigger things at stake, right?
Yes.
So.
Any other questions? You still have your hand up, Farhanaz. I'm just trying to make sure I have not.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you can. I'm just reminding you.
Lower. Okay.
Okay. Well, this has been a tremendous, wonderful, enlightening talk. I think we needed this at this point in our what's based on what's going on in the world. It is important for us to surface these ideas and be able to talk about them, because the world, you're right about one thing: the world needs hope, the world needs to be uplifted, the world needs to be told we can work this out, things are going to be all right. Nabil, you had a comment? Nabil?
I did not. I had my question already in the chat. Thank you. It's been very, very, very enlightening. I definitely did want to.
Just so you
thank you for
know, sorry. Just so you know that we are recording this thing on YouTube, so we will, our assembly, our community will have this on YouTube. If you wish to watch it again, you can go back to the Baha'i community of Austin. And
Tonight or no?
I think as soon as we hang up, it will be live on YouTube. So you can watch this talk again. And if you decide, I'm going to send a link out with this talk to everybody that participated. And frankly, those that did not participate, I'll send the link out so they can watch the talk again.
It was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
It was, absolutely. And just a reminder that our next talk is on June the 3rd, and our speaker will be Dr. David Smith. And David Smith is from Canada. Sovaida, I'm sure you met him at convention, of former consular, the year that Mr. Munajjim and Mr. Smith both came to the convention. So he's going to be our speaker. And I really look forward to seeing all of you and many more of you there on the 3rd.
Ajit, would you send me the link as well, please? And then I can
absolutely,
share it around.
absolutely. I will, as soon as we hang up from here, I will send the link over to you.
Wonderful, thank you.
Of course, Nabil is going to send it to me first. Nabil is running the show, you know, so
I
Nabil,
know, he's the quiet, powerful man in the background there. Let no one be fooled.
Oh my gosh.
Ajit, I was going to contact you to send me your notes about this thing I'm going to do tomorrow.
I'll send you the whole link. I'll send you the YouTube link. You watch it. And
yeah, I'm going to